Hi,
Welcome. Good morning. Good morning to Abhidya Alumni Meet for December. Um, I was thinking about how to start the conversation today, and while I was reading the book, I thought it's such a profound closure to this year with all that we have gone through. And I remember in the middle of this year, I was actually asking people around us, you know, is there a book on grief that I can learn about? Can I learn about how does grief operate and what does it mean? And how do you help, even if I'm not a therapist, how do I help some of my people or myself with so much going around? And since the time I started reading this book from honestly yesterday, I haven't been able to keep it back. And I just want to say thank you for producing this work. I know it has coming, it's coming from your own pain. It's taken a lot for you to be here, Neenaji. And I really want to say thank you for what you have become and how you have channelized your pain to produce a resource for this world. And thank you so much for taking out time for us today.
thank you so much.
Great. So today we have an hour with Neena ji, and we wish to learn a little bit. We are all coaches here. Grief is in now, especially after pandemic has become an integral part of our work. It's no more about coaching process. It's much beyond that. Our work demands us to learn about some certain, certain more modalities which may be falling in the premise of therapy, but then it's important for us to know and learn and have information around that. So that's what we are here for. We wish to learn from you today, Neena ji. Um, the poetic and the artistic way in which this book has been presented is made it very easy to read and flow through and connect. And believe me, on every page I cried because maybe it was channelizing my pain that was unsaid, unheard, channelized. And the biggest learning that I had so far in little pages is grief is not only about death. Grief is so much beyond that. So many types of griefs, and there are so many times we all go through grief, even if it is a breaking of trust, even if it is breaking of heart, even if it is breaking of a relationship. It's not only about departures. And that's very interesting because at times, and you have said it in so many words, so many times in the book, that grief is not a disease, right? And it touches everyone. So I'm very excited. As you say, I'm going on talking about it. I'm very excited to learn more from you and see where we go. So it'll be great if we can just start with introducing yourself a little bit and then we get on to it.
First of all, thank you so much, Jaya. Ever since this book has come out and since before, many people have been reaching out and talking at a personal level. And it's quite heartening as well as humbling to know that this book is being found a timely help by many. And but I think you're the first person who went a step ahead and thought of organizing a group conversation, what I call a growth conversation on this theme. So thank you for doing that. The ideal would be, you're saying that you can go on and on talking, that would be the ideal, and ideal would be if I keep quiet and I wait only if you have something to clarify or something to ask. But given the fact that you're still reading and you wanted me to talk about the book and tell people, so I would begin with a slight introduction, small introduction about myself, which is more in the context of the work that I do in the grief and growth realm. Otherwise, introductions, can go long. So some of you know that I have been an organization change and development expert with particular focus on appreciative inquiry and Jungian depth psychology and positive psychology and humanistic psychology as my primary methodologies that I have been relying on. And I got into coaching in 2005. And then slowly and gradually, as things progressed, I realized one day that the the formal training was also going to add meaning and value. So 2013, I completed my formal training and became a PCC. And meanwhile, in 2009, during the course of my coaching practice, I ventured into grief work, not by design or choice, but by just a set of circumstances taking me in that direction. I was doing a coaching assignment, and the coachee was a VP level person. And by third or fourth session, it became clear to me that whatever is being placed on the table, we all know that there are underlying issues, but here the underlying issue I could sense was layers and layers of unaddressed, solidified grief and trauma from childhood, series of losses, the boy becoming the man of the family, the provider of the family early on, the mother not being able to cope with the multiple pressures of grief, etc., and an overload of grief. And therefore, in the process, loss of childhood, multiple secondary losses. And over a period of time, how all those traumas and griefs and unaddressed pain had accumulated and created a grief overload. So I felt that I was not competent to handle it. I was not a trained therapist. And honestly, at that point in time, I had no background in grief work except as a layperson, any person who would be touched by grief at some point in time in life. So my familiarity with grief work was only at a personal level, not at a professional level. So I brought it to the attention of the sponsoring manager and the concerned HR person. And they had an internal conversation and they said that we want you only to continue because he's feeling a certain rapport and comfort with you. And whatever, somebody said that there's some disturbance. Actually, is it better now?
Yeah, I think it's coming from the movement, Neena ji. So
on the hands? Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. That's a personality hazard. I'll try to minimize it. Okay. Is it better now?
I think some fidget noise is there. I'm just trying to reduce.
Perhaps that is because my house is bang on the main road, and no matter how hard I try, I've kept all the doors and windows closed. But the noise from the road filters in somehow.
Carry on, please. I don't want to listen.
Yeah. So they said that we want you to continue, and I was very, very nervous because I said, it seems that is the issue, and how do I work? So they said, no, whatever emotional stuff he is bringing on table, if you could work around that at least, so at least there's room and space for him to ventilate some of the pressures and the pain that he's accumulated and has been on his heart ever since. So that's the kind of work that I did, not really on the issue or about the issue, but around the issue, around the secondary manifestations of the issue with him. And by the grace of God, at the end, he felt much benefited. On my suggestion, he later went for focused psychotherapy session also. And as much as I was feeling very happy, I was also feeling humbled, and my nervousness continued because I didn't have a formal background or professional background in grief. But somehow the word spread. We were based in Chandigarh at that point in time, and I was working with all three telecom companies and also many textile companies in Punjab and HP. So the word spread around because Tri-City is small and people are all the time interacting. So more and more such cases were coming my way. And as much as for some time my nervousness continued, but slowly and gradually it made way for curiosity and interest. And then eventually, some kind of a deeper level dedication to this work. And I said, yes, going forward, I want to shift to this work as much as possible. Of course, professional compulsions, monetary compulsions, financial requirements, they kept me still mainstreamed in my main work, which is OD and leadership and coaching. But slowly and gradually, my interest was building up and becoming bigger. in this area, and I started to take formal education in this. The major interruption happened in 2014 with my own tragedy, with my own loss, and which left me so shattered that for about a year and a half, I could not do any work, not even my regular consulting practice or coaching practice. So I kind of just slowly and gradually, as fast as I could, finish the assignments on hand, I withdrew and I just retreated into my shell. And so slowly and gradually, about 2 years later, when I started to return to work, because I had this, my appreciative inquiry mentors, the co-creators of appreciative inquiry, they kept persuaded me to return to work because in their own good ways, they thought that perhaps appreciative inquiry would help me reground or re-anchor myself in life. So that was the primary motivation with which I returned to work. But as I returned to work, I realized that no, grief was calling me. And so I focused all my attention then thereafter on for acquiring formal, education and training and doing more and more practice, a lot of grief volunteering that I have done with bereaved parents. I have done a lot of grief volunteering with people who donate the organs or cornea or tissues of their loved ones, and then the life that they live thereafter, because after that initial moment of humility and gratitude and that whole bubble of positivity, the trauma becomes even more severe, that culturally that the body was not complete when cremated, and so many other things they come in. So trauma becomes more pronounced, and in most cases the donation is happening where the departed has gone with a traumatic accident or some other kind of traumatic thing. So that traumatic bereavement itself is a heavy reason for grief. In many cases, complicated grief, what we call complicated grief. Then in 2020, 2019 and 20, I did quite a bit of trauma and grief volunteering with the students from DU and Jamia Millia and JNU, who were caught in the CA protests and all that. And many of them got roughed up for wrong reasons, and they collected quite a bit of trauma, and then the riots followed. So I did quite a bit of grief volunteering in the riot areas also, which then shifted to WhatsApp calls and video calls and audio calls and sometimes Zooms and Skypes and things like that, because the lockdown intervened. So all this was bubbling up. Meanwhile, in 2019, I got an invite from Appreciative Inquiry Practitioner Journal to do a specialist issue on grief and growth. That was in 2019, October. And they gave me a target for May 2020. And I said, no, that's not possible. Even though I'm a seasoned editor with you and I've done issues before, but 6 months on this theme particularly is just not possible. 6 months is what I will take to just design the issue and get in touch with potential contributors and commission the issue. How's that possible? They said, no, May 2020 is the issue we want you to lead. So as I worked on that, and my mentor, grief psychology mentor, Dr. Robert Niemeyer, was my co-editor on that. Slowly and gradually, the conversation began to emerge about bringing to market a book on grief that has focus on growth, where grief is the foundation that we need to have to get into this space. The focus remains on post-traumatic growth. And a book that is able to combine Western psychology and some of the Eastern principles, Eastern philosophy, because grief is not a work that you do entirely basis the science. There is much more of the self, the philosophical side of the self, the existential side of the self that is involved in that. So with that, the conversations began to happen, and then I created a certain book proposal, and it was with an international publisher. And that encouraged me to also, in 2016, I had published my grief memoir, that encouraged me to wonder if I could mainstream now that memoir, because that was getting attention, but because I had self-published, it was not really getting the backing of the publisher. So with that, I approached Rupa Publications to republish the grief memoir. That was in early 2020, before the pandemic was announced in India, Jan 2020. I heard back from them after the lockdown had started and saying that we wish that we had published it in the first instance, but something published, we'll have to have very solid reason to consider republishing. Right now, you're not a known author, so there's no reason that we have to republish. But I am very curious. This is the call that I had from MD. And MD said that I'm very keen for you to write a book for us on grief, where the focus, in his words, he said the focus should be on positivity. The focus should be on positivity. Now, positivity is such a widely used in multiple ways, and sometimes, misused or loosely used words. So I always tend to probe that when somebody says positivity, what do you really mean by that? So as we got to unpack what he had in mind with the word positivity, I realized that he was talking on the lines of that growth thing only. And so with this exploration, which happened over 4-5 calls, I consulted my mentor and I said, see, that book that we were talking, and the proposal is already with an international publisher. And they have told me that they would be reverting in the month of July 2020, and the initial mails are sounding positive. And meanwhile, this has happened. This is month of April 2020. And so his instant response to me was, Neena, go with it. Because we don't want one more academic book, a book on the academic shelves of the libraries, an academic and professional book. We want a book that everybody could relate to, that everybody could feel that grief is as much their subject as is the subject of a subject matter expert. And everybody feels invited to, and a book that supports every household in developing at least a basic level of grief literacy and a lot of growth orientation. So with that motive in mind, he said, Neena, go with this publisher. So 2 things happened simultaneously. One was in May, we began talking about what kind of book they wanted. And 5th May, that issue released, Grief and Growth issue released. 5th May 2020.
The growth is the place that we work in the coaching piece, and then how do we bring it together? So when we basically talk about growth and grief together, what we need to know.
Yeah. So with this, I think this is quite a bit of long introduction, but the introduction about setting the context for the book. And now with your permission, if I just take you through a few points, it's not going to be a teaching kind of a thing, but few basic things to know what the tagline of the session says, what the coaches should know and can do in that spirit. So So I'll do the screen share if you have.
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so the conversation that I like to call in the context of not just grief and growth, but also related themes like resilience, meaning, existential deep growth, life purpose, etc., is, I call it growth conversation. So that is what I look forward to having with you all today. Few basic things to know about grief. Jaya, I'm very tech clumsy. Please help me find a way to remove this. Okay, here I bring it to the bottom. Yeah, this was obstructing my view.
Now is it okay?
Hanji, hanji. So this maze of grief, loss, as we know, is in everybody's business. But as Jaya has already pointed out, loss is not just about death and bereavement, but there's a whole multitude of non-death losses. So there's loss of health, there's loss of vitality as we age, and there's a loss of functionality for people who encounter, accidents, which are kind of immobilizing. They leave them in reduced or depleted or mutilated or amputated state, or permanent immobility. Then the comatose people, for them it's a loss of life that they are in and yet not in, and it's a loss of normalcy for the family, it's a loss of peace for the family, it's a loss of time, good meaningful time that they would have with their loved one otherwise. So a whole set of non-death losses are also there. Of the many non-death losses, one non-death loss which very few people acknowledge, and sometimes, in fact, a lot of times it creates unseen, unrecognized complications, is the loss of pregnancy or the stillbirth. These are somehow, socially considered more like physiological events than psychological phenomenon or psychological existential situations. So as a result, non-death losses, something I would like all of us to notice is that loss of pregnancy, infertility, for not just the woman, but the family, for the couple. When the child, they want and they're trying and the child doesn't happen. So, and the stillbirth, these are huge non-death losses. Then there are ambiguous losses. One example that I could give to all of you is this disappearance of the Malaysian Airlines, which has left people, with questions forever. But the question which is most hurtful, most painful is the question of when to stop waiting and when to start grieving, as much as they are still grieving in a very ambiguous way. Primary loss is, of course, the loss of the person or the situation or the thing itself, and the secondary is the whole set of losses that the primary loss creates. So, for example, death of a breadwinner is a primary loss in terms of losing a family member, but there's a whole set of secondary losses in terms of losing the financial security, the social identity, especially in cultures like ours, where, for the family members, especially the wife, the identity is so fused with the husband that the social identity is also kind of lost or totally altered in a way that is not empowering at all. In organizational context, there are multiple losses, which we all are aware of, but unfortunately, not many people are talking about that. The loss of security, job security, the loss of opportunities, the loss of fairness when there's an organizational politics that takes over merit, loss of respect or dignity when you are stuck with a team, especially a boss who's not respectful and dignified in the way he works or leads his teams. So there's a whole set of losses which are not death losses. How do I move it forward now? Okay, here it is. I'm sorry, I'm a little clumsy with the... So bereavement, we all know, then bereavement is the state after loss. There could be traumatic bereavement that is mostly about the circumstances, but also when the death is untimely or unexpected. There's something called ultimate bereavement. Ultimate bereavement has come to be known as a common reference for child loss. Every bereavement is difficult. No two losses can be compared. That said, the loss of a child is considered a loss which perhaps has no closure ever. And that is not a worrisome thing as long as the grief has not turned pathological or complicated. Then bereavement in pandemic has been peculiarly complicated. The rituals, the closure rituals, the funeral rituals, forget about them. Even the last contact, the last parting goodbyes or the last touches have not happened with the loved ones. So bereavement in pandemic has thrown up many complicated manifestations for many people. Grief is a natural and normal loss, a response to loss. The most important thing to understand perhaps about grief is that it is sovereign. So it happens in its own way and in its own, at its own will, from person to person. In fact, even for the same person, from situation and life state and life position and time in life, it just, it has its own sovereign way. It will manifest at its own will. There are days and days which, when the person appears all normal, as in quotes, normal. And then there are days when we really can't figure out what's happening. Either the person is in a total shell, silence, or there's hysteria, or there's such a bewilderment that the bereaved person to you comes across like as if the person is sick and person needs medical attention. So grief manifests at its own will and in its own ways, especially in the initial periods when the shock is stronger than the pain. It is as uniquely personal as it is universal. There's a grief psychologist, eminent grief psychologist called William Borden. He's put it very beautifully, adapting from the Gordon Allport's famous quotation, which says that everybody is like everybody else, and everybody is like somebody else, and everybody is like nobody else. That is what the famous personality legend Gordon Allport had said once. And William Borden has adapted it in grief context, saying that everybody's grief is like everybody else's grief. Everybody's grief is like somebody else's grief. And everybody's grief is like nobody else's grief. And I would say that, I tend to follow the last one more than the other two. Especially, in case of shared losses, I have seen. So shared loss, like, the loss of a child, even between couples, the way they engage with their grief, with their bereavement, is so vastly different from each other. And sometimes it creates some couple issues also, because there are unconscious expectations to come along one's way of grieving, while the other person's way of grieving is totally different. There are many phases that grief takes. Anticipatory is when somebody's loved one has been in a terminal stage for some time, for a lot of time, especially, I've seen that parents of children who have faced terminal conditions with sometimes for a few weeks and sometimes lingering over years, comatose patients and their caregivers. So the kind of stress that they have been accumulating hides behind a sense of anticipatory grief. And when the moment comes, the way it explodes, the anticipatory grief quite often sometimes turns into becoming a complicated or an acute state of grief. Ambiguous grief is, I've already given you an example of ambiguous loss, like disappearance of Malaysian Airlines. So ambiguous grief happens then when you're grieving, but you do not know whether to give yourself a permission to really talk about your grief, or to allow your grief to be expressed and brought into the fore. Disenfranchised also, I have mentioned before, for example, loss of pregnancy and stillbirth. And then, there are more acute conditions, like if somebody's loved one has died of suicide or of drug overdose or of some other kind of stigmatic, so-called stigmatic condition, or there's a relationship which has not been solemnized, a relationship which has not been socially made public, or has been made socially public but has not been socially approved or accepted. In such a situation, as much as the person is grieving, that person's grief is not allowed or not given a sense of social sanction and support. So these disenfranchised grief, ambiguous grief, anticipatory grief situations very often have a way of becoming acute or prolonged, and unfortunately in some states also complicated. Why coaches should know this? Because perhaps this complicated and prolonged grief state is something that is definitely beyond our realm as coaches. However, the normal kind of bereavement, where the person has still retained a sense of functionality, a sense of mental functioning, though it does get affected in many ways, but mental functioning in terms of the coherence that the person has retained. In such situations, which is a large fraction of the situation, we coaches do have a role to play. Even if we personally feel kind of little, incapacitated to work in the grief realm, we can definitely see if the client is more ready for growth conversations, that's where our work can begin. So normal kind of bereavement is what is the zone where we should and we do have a role to play, not directly addressing the grief, but working around in the growth atmosphere. The anticipatory, ambiguous, disenfranchised, if it has evolved into complicated grief, that is what we should stay away from. That is perhaps is the realm of a therapist. Myths and conceptions. Grief has no timeline, even for what we would call a normal bereavement, which has happened after a life lived full and well, and there's no trauma attached to the event of the death, and there's some kind of an acceptance at mental and emotional level. Even in such situations, for us to say that there would be a timeline to grief, I'm sorry, that's not a fair assumption to hold. That's not a fair expectation to hold. There's no set trajectory or no linear stages. There's a popular model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which has been, I'm sorry to say, has been totally misinterpreted and misused in grief context. First, to begin with, Dr. Kubler-Ross' model was not for the grief and the grieving, but for the end-of-life situation of those who were dying, and to some extent for the caregivers of the dying. So it was in the context of dying. And then later, as Dr. Kubler-Ross realized over years of her practice, she herself felt that the stages were not linear and stages were not universal. Not everybody would go through what she called stage, and not everybody would go through the same order of the stages. So this, I'm telling you as coaches, because this is a very popular model, which now Western world has debunked some years ago, but perhaps to us, it has got introduced much later. So we tend to use it in the context of organizational change also, leadership transitions also. And now of late, I've heard many people talk of this model in the context of grief work. I would encourage you to think of phases, not stages. And talking of phases, there's much more deeper clarity that we need to have. And know that there's nothing linear and there's no set trajectory. The biggest myth is time will heal, move on. I'm sorry, there's no moving on from grief. As long as the memory of your loved one is alive in your heart, which it is, in 99.9% cases, I like to assume 100% cases. As long as the presence lives on in your heart and consciousness, you don't move away from the memory, from the presence. And as long as you do not move away from the love part of your relationship, you cannot move away from grief. Why? Because in the next slide, as we would learn, grief is the cry of love. There's several metaphors. This is another thing that coaches should know. Sometimes people would use words like that I'm deluged by a tsunami of emotions. It's a sand dune, I'm getting more and more sucked into it. It's a black hole. I feel that I'm forever going to remain sucked in that and never be able to find light on either side of the tunnel. People would use words like, I'm in a whirlpool, I'm in a swamp, it's a hurricane, it's a storm. So when you hear such strong metaphors, people using for the situations or their states of being, perhaps it would be useful to allow that metaphor to unpack and see if there is a grief thing also in the underlying issues realm. So pay attention to the metaphors, strong metaphors like these when clients are talking of them. Quite likely they could be in context of some other situations. However, there's no harm in checking if they are about unaddressed or unarticulated or unexpressed grief also. There's a labyrinth of multi-level manifestations. So at brain level, we know that it's all about neurochemicals. So brain gets very badly affected. I was known in my family for my mental math superlative capacities, and it got very badly affected. For the first time ever in my life, I was using a calculator on my phone. And so many other things happened. I was forgetting. I was sometimes not able to put the dots together as fast or as, at the unconscious level as one would do, and I used to do so easily and with effectiveness. So there's a mental level of manifestations, and cognitive functioning gets affected. Sometimes forgetfulness is so acute that it's not uncommon to hear early grievers particularly even talk of losing a sense of direction and a sense of way, in terms of losing not remembering the routes which they were otherwise generally taking, so landing at different places, sometimes even forgetting the way back to their home. Why? Because home is also an anchor for the realm, the immediate strong space of grief. So the mind kind of starts to fog you in that sense. Bodily manifestations. Very few people talk of bodily manifestation. Grief hits mind and heart and soul, but grief hits body perhaps the strongest. Within 3 months of my loss, I lost 13 kgs of weight. I used to have a thick crop of hair. I lost nearly 60-70% of my hair. And I was, a neighbor one day expressed concern, saying that you look ghost-like. I was so mentally preoccupied with myself that I neither noticed his concern and good intention, nor his extreme description of me that you look ghost-like kind of hit me. Neither of the two registered with me. I developed a couple of years later, I developed type 2 diabetes. So at the body level, this again is something for coaches to know. The multi-level manifestations, the emotional and the behavioral is something that we will easily notice. But if you hear your client talk of emotional, behavioral, bodily, mental, relational, and more than that, an existential crisis of faith, and because grief sometimes shatters your assumptive world, the way you have understood life, the way you have been viewing human life and the world, your worldviews, they tend to get shattered and questioned. So they could be an existential crisis of faith also. When you hear a client give you glimpses of all, at least most of these issues, it's time for you to take a pause, step back, and allow the client to unpack a little bit more and see if there is an underlying grief issue there. Finally, there's an entangled ball of emotions, as we can all assume. However, one emotion which is perhaps most bothersome, most punishing, is the hidden emotion of guilt. Not just an ultimate bereavement or traumatic bereavement, where very often the bereaved are punishing themselves for not being able to save or not being able to do enough, or etc. etc. They're forever caught up in what ifs and if onlys, etc. etc. But even in the normal kind of bereavement, sometimes there's a recovery guilt, sometimes there's a survivor guilt. Recovery guilt is quite pronounced. We do not give ourselves permission to return to experiencing life in a normal way. We do not give ourselves permission to return to experiencing small or big joys of life. So recovery guilt is huge, and recovery guilt always shows up disguised as something else. So as coaches, when you come across acute or unclear emotions, look for some kind of a hidden guilt. It may not necessarily be about grief, but if it is about grief, you know your work with the coachee has to be slightly different than it would be in other situations. Grief ultimately is a journey, often with no closure, that I have already talked about. And why no closure? Because grief is the cry of love. I will not get into the detail of this, but those of you who are interested to read the book, you will read in the chapter 4, my model for grief affirmation, which I call alive. And these are 5 phases or aspects of grief affirmation, which about me is acknowledging that you're still alive. And if you're still alive, your first and most important sacred duty and most sacred tribute to your loved one is to continue affirming life. And you continue affirming life by beginning to affirm grief, affirm your grief, not cope with it, not deal with it, not manage it, but affirm grief so you learn to live with grief. I'll not get into the details of this. We don't have time for it. This is, Jaya, the question that you were asking, how do we move to the growth side? We don't have to necessarily move to the growth side. What we have to remember is that loss, trauma, grief, and love transformation growth, they live in an eternal spiral. So as human beings, we are constantly experiencing emotional affect. And if we are experiencing emotional affect, it doesn't mean that we would forever be on one side of the loop, eternal spiral of life. We would keep shifting at various times in life, at various stages in life. We would keep shifting our locations on the eternal spiral of life. And so this is how I present grief and growth in an eternal spiral, where if you're on the loss, trauma, and grief realm, these are the kind of possible, manifestations that you may experience. Having said, if you allow yourself to move with life, not moving on in life, but keep moving with life, life itself will guide you slowly and gradually towards the other side of the eternal spiral, which is the side of the growth, which is where love remains stronger than the pain of the loss, where trauma finds a way to manifest and in a different way and allow you to be transformed by your pain, not traumatized by your pain, not tormented by your pain, not broken and shattered by your pain, but a kind of humble witnessing of your pain, and then allowing your pain to transform you. And grief eventually finds a co-pilgrim. There's no grief to growth. I maintain it is grief and growth. Growth does not demand that grief be done with and over, then only I will begin. This is one of the biggest myths. And grief does not banish out growth. Grief and growth and grace, as you would read in the book, I'm calling, my humble proposition is that grief, growth, and grace are co-pilgrims. They do not preclude or banish out each other. And this growth side, love transformation and growth side, is perhaps a zone where we coaches have quite a bit of role to play. Of course, if we realize that the grief side is continuing to have pathological or medical or complicated implications and manifestations, then it is our noble duty to encourage the client to seek that kind of help that they really need in the therapeutic space or in the medical space. Having said that, if we notice that the client is in a natural and organic way, slowly and gradually getting ready or even getting shifted in the growth zone, that's where perhaps we have some work to do and we should do. I'm sorry, I'm a little kind of, not so efficient with the presentations, online presentations. So chat things, if you're putting something, I'll not be able to attend to it now. Maybe we can address that later. Post-traumatic growth, all of you who are interested to learn more, I would encourage you to read books by Richard Tedeschi. There are more books. Lawrence Colhern, Professor Lawrence Colhern has not published as many books as he's published the papers, but these are the two people from University of Carolina, Charlotte campus, if I remember right. These are the two professors who have created and pioneered the whole concept of post-traumatic growth. And thank God, and God bless them for this, because the huge discourse around post-traumatic stress disorder had been completely, swallowing up the space in which the trauma and grief were being talked about. And there was little discussion or discourse or research happening on the growth side of it. And it became more and more pronounced and taken forward once Lawrence Colhorn and Richard Tedeschi, they, through their pioneering research, proposed this phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, which they say that typically manifests in 5 ways. In 5 ways it shows up. That is that there's an enhanced personal strength, and the relationships tend to become deeper and richer and more meaningful with the people who are still there. And I would like to add to that, even your relationship with the departed one, with your loved one, also reaches a different level. My son, before his leaving his mortal body, was the most important person in my life. He continues to be the most important person in my life, and his presence is alive. And my relationship with him has got even deeper, even richer, even stronger, even more meaningful. Then there's a greater appreciation for life. Very often I'm reminded in 2009 when I had contracted a certain medical condition because I'd reacted to a particular medicine after an accident, minor accident. And that turned into something bigger, that side effect of that medicine turned into something bigger, and it got wrongly diagnosed as blood malignancy. And an oncologist at PGI gave me a few weeks. And obviously I was disturbed because my elder one he had just gotten into class 12, and my younger one was 4 years as junior. And obviously, life just kind of, started to look like it has come apart. And more than my own health or whether I would survive or not, immediately the mother's mind and the mother's heart was overworking and getting high. It is as simple as that. You're not dead as long as you're alive. And this sentence has stayed with me. By the way, it is showing up on my screen that my internet connection is unstable. Am I audible to everyone?
Now you are, Neena.
Okay, thank you. So that statement I'm often reminded of whenever I talk of greater appreciation for life as a manifestation of post-traumatic growth. It's very simple, like what my son put at that point in time, that you're not dead as long as you're alive. But if you go deeper into that statement, if you allow that statement to sink deeper into you, there's so much more that unfolds. There's so much more that shows up, and there's so much more that inspires you and nudges you on in life, not just at the level of survival, but at a more meaningful level of engaging with life with some kind of a meaning, some kind of a purpose, some kind of a life view. Then the openness to new possibilities for all those who experience post-traumatic growth. The two good professors, they argue that openness to new possibilities in these people is far more pronounced than in people who tend to remain in a stage I like to call other than post-traumatic growth. I'm sorry, I do not like to use the word post-traumatic stress, because that is a kind of language. If we engage with ourselves and with our clients with language and words like this, it creates a different set of mind. So I like to say that not yet in post-traumatic growth, or not in post-traumatic growth. I like to avoid the word post-traumatic stress completely, especially because it also comes with post-traumatic stress disorder. Grief is not a disorder, as Jaya pointed out in the beginning. Grief is not a disease. Grief is not a pathological condition. Grief comes from an event of life, which is a significant event, like many other events, like marriage is a significant event, like childbirth is a significant event, like we getting into professions and completing, graduating with, there's so many significant events. bereavement is also a significant event. Grief is a natural response to that. Then finally, openness to new possibility also means that we are able to find and create new meaning and purpose in life at a different level. This is what post-traumatic, this is the zone of post-traumatic growth. Those of you who like to use stories in your coaching work, I would encourage you to read Tagore's story that I have shared in tiny glimpses on page 60. By the way, each chapter, that brings me to mention that each chapter starts with an abstracted account, a vignette of a true grief story, except chapter 11, which is the last chapter, which is the only chapter where I have non-human story. All names and identities have been suppressed for obvious reasons of dignity and safety and confidentiality. And what you read are abstracted accounts. Then in between, in the chapters also, there are vignettes, tiny vignettes. I am sure that even as coaches, people who are not trained grief practitioners, you would be able to relate to a lot of what goes in those stories. But especially if you're talking of post-traumatic growth in any of your session or in your discourse with anybody, I would encourage you to read Tagore's story on page 60. Then finally, one more body of work which has inspired and influenced not just my work, but more than that, my life very strongly is Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. This again, if you ignore the word therapy for a moment, I would say that in times and scenarios like these, where it seems like pandemic has somehow come to become an ongoing reality and it doesn't seem to go away. Every time we feel like, there's some kind of normalcy return happening, something else is happening, and then and in the process, then grief is also becoming loss, trauma. Grief is also becoming an ongoing reality. And no matter what work we do as coaches, we would come across clients who in their primary way or at a secondary level, they are encountering all of this. So I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with logotherapy work of Viktor Frankl. I have kept these books handy, which I will, can you see, or shall I stop sharing and then show you? I assume many of you must have read this. Those who have not, please do. And in addition, if you want to read this book, this will introduce you to the hardcore process and methodology and the basic tenets of logotherapy, that in Frankl's own words, not the adapted. So therefore, it can be a little heavy and dense reading because it was initially more written as a researcher and a professional. But I'm sure that all of us are capable enough to make sense of it. It's a short book, but very will take time. At least for a slow reader like me, it takes time. But I've been reading it since ages, I don't know since when, and I have read it multiple times. This is a shorter and easier read, and it's a very timely and helpful read for all of us. With this, let me take you. I'll share the details of these books with Jaya, and so these are the fundamental, tenets of logotherapy. These are the three pillars that logo, we all know, means meaning in Greek. And so this whole Viktor Frankl's work went beyond the traditional Freudian approach, which was will to pleasure, that everything in psychology is guided by human will to pleasure. So therefore, much of that remained at the body level. And then was Adler's work, which said will to power, that human psychology, human functioning is all about, becoming better, excelling. So that came from the power realm. So whether it is power by achievement or power by status or power by competition. So that was then the shift happened towards mind. So from body being the focus in Freudian work to mind being the focus in Adler work, will to power. Viktor Frankl proposed will to meaning. That is in the zone of spirit. What in their it's the word that they use is neogenic. Noogenic. So that is new is the word for spirit. So that is where he says that will to meaning is the primary driver for human being, even in what we would call so-called normal situation. Normal, not really grief or trauma related situations, but normal situation. Choosing to see beyond the fence is a beautiful metaphor from his narration in Man's Search for Meaning. For those of you who have read, would perhaps recall this thing that Frankl talks about, that one day every day there was horrendous. Every moment was horrendous in the concentration camps. And he was in one of the worst camp, Auschwitz camp. He was in 3 different camps, but one of which was Auschwitz. And on a particularly more horrendous day, because the weather was also extremely troubling and trying, one inmate suddenly called out to everybody and said, come out, I will show you something. And most of the people who came out, many people did not. Most of the people who came out hoping and assuming that maybe that day they are being given half a ladle extra of soup. The soup itself was nothing more than soap water kind of a thing. But they just came out rushing, hoping and assuming that maybe there's a little bit extra soup being given that day. And when they came out, he just pointed his fingers towards the horizon beyond the fence of the camp, of the prison. And there was a beautiful sunset happening. And somebody from the group remarked, how would it be? How would the life be beyond the fence when we would be back in our homes? So that is such a powerful metaphor. Freedom of will is about choosing. Will to meaning is about being able to see what meaning of life beyond the fence. So choosing to see beyond the fence, I would encourage all of you to read that story. And ultimately, it all translates into saying yes to life, which is about affirming life, about exercising your will, because all of us are born with what, Viktor Frankl and then I think Maslow also talked very strongly about, which is that we all have that inherent capacity to exercise our will. And all of you are familiar with that famous quotation by Viktor Frankl. I am damn sure that most of you must have used it in your coaching work and training work at some point in time, which is that last of all the human freedoms that nobody can take away from you is the freedom to choose your attitude, the freedom to choose your way. Like Viktor Frankl did, but there are many unknown and unsung Holocaust prisoners and many in our own local India prisons about whom we do not know and how they are choosing their way despite their circumstances. So this quotation by Viktor Frankl, I think personally, is a very strong tool in the hands of coaches. In that space is the word. In the second line, in that space, perhaps these 3 words. What is that space? That space is the mindful pause space. That space can remain impulsive and reactive space for most of us if we are coming only from the primitive brain, the primal brain. But slowly and gradually, as we go up in the brain, the emotional brain, and then the prefrontal, that is where I think the coaches' work is happening. Coaches are trying to engage their clients more and more in the prefrontal. And in the prefrontal, perhaps we can help our coachees and our clients look at that space, that space as a mindful pause, a space that is a generative pause, and encourage more and more our clients to stay in that space for as long or as meaningfully as possible. Then we do not have a lot of time. I'll very quickly just show you a few things. This is a very relevant thing about the kind of work that you people can do, we people can do as coaches with our clients who are coming to you with a grief and trauma-like scenario. I will convey to Jaya the specific page number I'm forgetting. It is there in chapter 3 for sure, I remember, but it is somewhere, I think, on page 75 or 65, something I'm forgetting. You will read about growth wisdom. So mystic of growth is, look at the metaphor of lotus. And then again, as coaches, we have a lot of scope of helping our clients come to terms with their situations, especially if they are coming from non-death grief scenario. Maybe we may not feel fully equipped or fully ready yet to work with the death ensuing grief, but the grief, the pain that comes from non-death losses. And many of our coaches actually are bringing issues like, job loss, opportunity loss, promotion loss, fairness loss, diversity and inclusion issues are there, etc., etc. Equitability issues are there, and equity issues are there in organization context. So just consider using the lotus metaphor. Now, lotus at no point is disowning or disregarding or discounting its base. The base continues to be the mud. This is where the lotus has grown. So similarly, growth acknowledges grief as its base. And then lotus expands and opens up to the skies, not to the person alone. But when you expand and open up, you are expanding and opening up in the service of your entire ecosystem, not just you alone. So that's the grace part. So grief and the growth and the grace in the context of my book and my model, but for you people to see that lotus exemplifies this metaphor. See if you want to use, especially with deep psychological layers issues or emotional issues, and especially in situations where your coachee is exhibiting some kind of an existential crisis also, some existential dilemma or existential crisis, especially existential crisis of faith. This is my model, which I call growth mandala model. It starts from chapter 3. This is the heart and mind of the book. Entire part 2, the 7 chapters, third chapter introduces the model and the concept of post-traumatic growth and growth wisdom. And then chapter 4 to chapter 9 are all about the 6 different phases of growth mandala, which is grief affirmation. This is the pictorial of the model. So I have used a mandala framework for that. So it starts in the outermost ring. Those of you interested to know why I've used mandala, I would encourage you to read it in the book, please, because we don't have time for it. And why I use the metaphor of pilgrimage, that also I have explained in depth in the book. So grief affirmation is one phase. By the way, I have emphasized in the book again and again that these phases are not in any particular order. I have put them in order only because the growth acronym just encapsulates the whole model so beautifully. And you have to use some order in the book. So I have put them in the order which I have seen most typically manifest. But having said that, for some people, for many people I've seen say they straight away jump to resilience and way to well-being. Most of the people, they go and do their work in the second phase, which is resilient adaptation, and the way to well-being phase, which means a little bit of work happening in the opening to the emergent phase also. But actually very few people I have seen going into the innermost layer of transformation and meaningful reemergence in life and self-transcendent return to the world. So, but nonetheless, I have explained all of them in this order only. You don't have to follow that order. You just go to the phase which calls you the most or you feel most drawn to. This is the model, growth mandala model. And this is an exercise I hoped we could do. We don't have time. And eventually the book concludes with Marvel of Grace, which is where I have talked of something which at least I didn't come across in any grief book in a focused way, maybe a passing mention, of course, but something which I feel is extremely important, especially in the context of grief, which most of us perhaps do not recognize. Forgiveness is a big thing, even in a so-called normal bereavement, because very often Bereavement means that we question the ways of destiny. We question the ways of God. We have several whys for what we call God or supreme power or supreme one or supreme grace. But because of social misjudgment and because of social pressures and the social norms, etc., we do not allow ourselves also to feel this, because this is blasphemous to be angry with God and to be angry with destiny and to be angry with world for going about their business as usual when I'm hurting so much. How can the whole world be so happy? So there's a very vague sense of angst that can develop, a very vague sense of resentment that can develop, that often develops, right? So especially in unexpected losses, traumatic losses, violent losses. So forgiveness is something that I would encourage you to read, even if you are not thinking of this book in terms of grief, because forgiveness could be something that we encounter even with our coaches, maybe not very often, but sometimes we do. And so in this chapter, I have talked about how forgiveness is the self-transcendent path to a higher way of being, to a deeper way of being, and how forgiving the unforgivable is possible. And forgiveness begins by seeking forgiveness yourself. That's what I have maintained. And then finally, the chapter Grace Way, which is where it begins with Jaya's pet project, gratitude. Jaya has done phenomenal work in that. And I remember that on my gentle nudge, she even contributed an article to AI Practitioner on gratitude. And so that was beautiful work that you did, Jaya. I hope that you start it again. And then reverence for life is the main thing. What I talked before, appreciation for life as a post-traumatic growth manifestation, and what my son said in very simple words when he was not yet 17, that, Mama, but you're not dead as long as you're alive. And if you're alive, you better keep living. So that reverence for life, that life is happening even till last breath. The decay is there. That's a truth. The immobility is there, perhaps. That's a truth. Loss of health is there. That's a truth. Loss of mobility, loss of functioning, loss of all that. Loss of dignity, because you are somehow dependent on others when you have been independent all your life and others are doing your basic stuff. All of that is there. But the life has not stopped yet. And if life has not stopped yet, life still has some promises. If not big promises, at least promise of a smile. In the midst of this, despite this, along with all this. So reverence for life is what takes us to also the stage where we can say yes to life, the affirmation of life. And of course, compassion, but most of all, self-compassion. Self-compassion, anyways, we've been talking about. Many people from Delhi chapter have been, reaching out to me to talk about self-compassion work. So self-compassion is anyways, the theme of the day, it seems to me from what I hear from people. And a sense of life, I have used the word essence instead of meaning, which is a more popular word only to get the acronym right, which is grace. But they mean the same. In fact, essence is at a deeper level than meaning. What truly is the meaning of life? And as Viktor Frankl insisted, that meaning of life is no really big thing, lofty thing, that you have to go search for it in the Himalayas or in Vipassana all the time. Meaning of life is happening in every single moment. And that is again a zone where we coaches do a lot of work, which is the zone of here and now. Coaching presence and coaching space is all about what's unfolding in this moment, in this space of the work that coachee is doing, and I'm only supporting and facilitating and kind of holding the space. So the holding of the space, a very popular catchy phrase that we use in coaching work, is all about in the moment. And essence of life can be and should be and is often discovered in the moment. And essence of life is essentially phenomenological. It is from a person's own experience. Even if you're using a tarot card or a visual card for deeper unconscious revelations with a client, it's not about the normative description of that card in the manual. It's about the meaning that the client is making out of that visual image. So it's entirely phenomenological. It is from the phenomenology point of view of the person who is at the center of the work. Finally, the book ends with a prayer that I have composed on page number 279. Feel free to use it anywhere, everywhere, with yourself, with your loved ones, with your clients, in your work, in your life. I hope that this prayer sinks to your heart and offers you some kind of, sense of groundedness, if not sense of inspiration or direction. That is it. I don't have more to say. I'm open to questions if you have any, and this is where I would like to conclude. You will find this quotation on page 75, but I don't have to tell you the source because this is such a popular thing. I would say that, I don't know how many of us have seen Lord of the Rings. Somehow watching the movie gets you, helps you get the grasp of a particular movement or a particular phrase much more than reading it in the book. But if you have, perhaps, I think it is part 3, if I remember right, where Gandalf is saying this to Pippin, that all that we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. I would say just go and watch that phrase, that frame, and maybe a little before that frame also, but just that frame, try to absorb the essence of that frame and that moment when Gandalf has delivered these words and the way he's delivered these words, and allow that the whole spirit of that frame to touch you. That is it. Thank you, Jaya, for creating this opportunity. And as I'm notorious for not being time efficient, I'm sorry. I've lived up to the notorious image that I carry.
Thank you, Neena ji. Can you stop sharing? We can
just... Yes, absolutely.
I'm in loss of words because it seems that the book offers you much more than what you have. I think it's your life's work. It's just so much of value coming through each and every page. And what I loved about every page is the poetic affirmations, the paths that you have provided, and each one of it is so full of wisdom that I just feel like soaking in each time I read.
Glad that you mentioned this poetic affirmation things, because this is where each chapter concludes, and I call it path, poetic affirmation to take home. And it's not without meaning that it is called path. Yeah. Because this is each chapter is not concluding, but each chapter is culminating to open up a path. And I'll not say anything more than this, just to kind of clarify, as I mentioned in the invocation also of the book, that I wouldn't take any credit or claim for my story or my experience, my lived experience only being the source of this work. I, in fact, credit it entirely to what I've learned from my grief mentor, but several other experts also. What I have learned from peers, many peers with whom I have been in learning experiences, and but most of all from people who have allowed me the privilege to journey with them in their grief journey, and witness it become a pilgrimage. Grief journeys, witness it becoming a growth and grace pilgrimage. The stories that they have shared with me, the glimpses of their lives that they have provided with me, has taught me much more than what I have learned from books and training courses and peer experiences and mentoring. That is precious learning, but much more precious learning is this. And of course, being a bereaved person yourself, and that to ultimate bereavement person yourself, does give you a sense of perspective on life to be able to take in those experiences at a slightly deeper level. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great. So I'm going to invite, I know I have spoken a lot. I do want to invite everybody to share their questions, insight, comments, compliments, whatever they would like. Yoshita, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, I was waiting to talk to Dr. Neena. Hi, Dr. Neena. We've
Hello,
spoken.
please call me Neena. Please call me Neena. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we've spoken once about Subha, if you may recall that.
Yeah, I remember that many people from ICF Delhi had reached out, but I was myself in critical COVID and then long COVID, and even now the strength is totally at the zero level. So I'm sorry, help me recall. Many people from ICF Delhi had reached out.
So there is this community we have of these COVID widows, and so there are about 200 of them now. And we have a lot of coaches, even from Abhyuday, who are there and, volunteering. My question to you is really coming from a recent conversation that I've had with them, where it's been now 6 months, they've lost their husbands. And that grief, like you said, keeps coming back, even though there's a lot of practical life that you have to take on. But they keep saying, will we ever feel happy again? Will we ever feel joy again? And this question that, and one person even said that even if for a moment I start feeling happy, then I immediately feel guilty. That as though I'm not supposed to feel happy, So I just wanted to hear from you, from your own experience and from your understanding in doing work in this field. What would be your message to such people? What would be your perspective?
So one thing that I would, couple of things that I would like to remind you from my presentation today is, one is, as I said, that there's no set timeline or trajectory to grief. To each their own, to each many of their own, even to each many of their own, ways and phases and stages in life. So to expect that, to say that so many months have happened and when will it start happening is perhaps not is a question or a probe which is not really going to help very much. But if you could help them shift to how they have been on a day-to-day basis, like in Alcoholic Anonymous, it is said, one day at a time. I say one moment at a time, one breath at a time. How on a breath-to-breath basis, they are experiencing themselves differently. And in appreciative inquiry, as we say, that focus on the moments which are offering you a sparkle, howsoever tiny. How to bring those moments to their consciousness, not by negating other moments, not by discounting other moments, but slowly and gradually bringing the shift there. And in fact, not to scare you, but let me tell you, it has been found through research studies that in ultimate bereavement, mostly so, but in many of the widow losses also, especially with the widowers, those who lose wives in cultures like ours, and they continue to remain loyal to whatever, and they choose a solitary life, etc. Grief in the second year is much more acute and much more heavy and much more solid sometimes than in the beginning. And people get totally baffled and puzzled by what's happening. And it is perhaps because in the first year, so much of the activity is also happening, which kind of masks and disguises and leaves little room for grief's rawness to be experienced. You're figuring out things, you're trying to arrange a household, the finances, other responsibilities of life, their rituals, especially in our cultures, rituals are happening until the first year, especially so many pujas and things like that. Activities are happening. Your house keeps buzzing with visitors more in the beginning than in the later part. So second year's grief is sometimes much more hard, especially in traumatic bereavement, ultimate bereavement, and widow bereavement more with widowers than, but I would not say that necessarily this applies to us also, because this widower research is more in the Western world. I don't have any knowledge of any such research in India. And the third thing I would encourage you to remember, and then not say this to your clients, but find a way to bring this to their consciousness whenever they create an opportunity or you find an opportunity, is that grief and growth are co-pilgrims. So this is when you said, one woman said that there are some days I'm feeling joy, but then it disappears. I would encourage you to tell her about something from page 29 of the book, which is where I have talked about a widow who said that for me, it was an endless sand dune. There was no end to the sand, and I was getting more and more swamped in the sand, which is also abrasive sand. Not just swampy, but also abrasive. Her metaphor for that was sand dune, never-ending sand dune. There's no sight of the other side. And slowly and gradually, as she stayed put, she kept witnessing her grief without necessarily wanting to intervene with it, but allowing the moments to unfold, and stayed put on a moment-to-moment basis with some kind of faith alive in her heart. She found that her metaphor slowly started to change from sand dune to oasis in the midst of the sand dune. Oasis is not the whole of the desert, remember. But oasis is definitely a beautiful part of the desert. I don't know whether I have answered your question or not, but I would be happy to come to your session and talk more.
Yeah, I would love to have you there. And thank you. That was very insightful. And I think that was very revealing to me that second year grief is more acute. I hadn't looked at it like that. We thought that, okay, we have done what we had to do. And, so in our ignorance. Thank you for
not really ignorance, I would say. Somehow the Google and the internet and the professional space has been so much filled up with that 5 stages model of Kubler-Ross. It's created quite a bit of myth around it. And the interesting part is nobody knows that she herself debunked it in later part of her work.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Jaya?
Hi, Neena. I like to share the point.
Who's speaking? I can't see on this screen.
Sorry. This is Anushli, by the way. I'm not in a question.
Jaya, can we put it on the... Okay, I can do the view of the speaker mode now at my end.
Yeah, Anushli is off video.
Okay.
My video switched off. And excuse me for the background noise. There's a construction happening.
The name sounds very familiar.
I like to thank you for bringing out this few key things, like there's no end to this process.
No, I would not say there's no end. I would say that there's no necessary closure to grief, because grief is not only about or all about pain. Grief is much more about love and faith.
Yeah. So because I've seen like a lot of people, they want to bring it to closure and also faster. And they don't give enough time, and also they compare one grief to another. And I myself have gone through two very painful grief experiences, and for one it took me like 10 years to come out of it, and for another it took me like 5 years to come out of it. And as you correctly said, at the point of it happened, it wasn't that hurtful. The more and more the days passed, I mean, following year or whatever. And the beauty of it was, I only had the power to come out of it. And that's where I feel that the coaches have a great power in making the difference in this process.
Thank you for sharing this. What you said in the end is, of course, I think we all kind of somehow believe and also trying to practice is that ultimate power is within, and the magic is within, and that is the whole phenomenon of post-traumatic growth and growth wisdom, and my model of growth Mandala is all about. that how to allow the phenomenon of growth to unfold without negating, disowning, abandoning, or getting rid of grief or getting over it. Anushali, if you don't mind, can I offer a couple of unsought for suggestions?
Yeah, sure. Please do.
So I think somewhere maybe we all agree that we coaches also do quite a bit of work through our language and through our words and the metaphors and the constructs that we use. They influence also. So, you know, to say that it took me 10 years to get out of it or 5 years to get out of it is perhaps also at an unconscious level conveying two messages, that they could be a timeline, and second, that grief is about getting out of it. You know, I like to use a word which was actually gifted to me by my younger son. He used this word, that there's nothing to be gotten over. Grief is perhaps to be transcended and taken to a different level. So for you to say that it took me some time to transcend grief, and in other case, it took a little lesser time, but nonetheless, you know, I transcended both my grief states and your last sentence, and took it in the direction of what you said in the end.
Thank you so much. Yes, language plays a major role. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Your name sounds very familiar, Anushali. Do we know each other? I don't know.
No, this is the first time we are meeting. Anyway, maybe in the last words, I don't know.
No, I think I received your LinkedIn invite, if I remember right.
Oh, right. Maybe then
a couple of weeks
in
ago.
your book,
A couple of weeks
probably,
ago.
I saw your book through LinkedIn, probably. And maybe,
Yes.
That the title was very attractive, like the.
Because it's a unique name, so I remember. Thank you.
Saranda?
Yeah, I'm going to take the liberty of calling you Neena.
Please, I'm so happy.
Yes,
I'm so happy.
So thank you so much for this. You know, I think it's been overwhelming. It's been profound. It has spoken to me in ways that I cannot describe. And as I'm sure that's true for most of us here today. So I really want to thank you. I have ordered the book, but I think the book, while it will be what it is, and I now look forward to even more to reading it, hearing you talk in itself has been a very enlightening and a profound experience. So thank you for sharing so much of yourself with us today. Few things that struck with me is the fact that the guilt factor, is the fact that, yes, the guilt takes a long time to go away. And especially when you have to let go of something. That's when, you know, that guilt stays for a very long period of time. It could be something, you know, a person, it could be your loved pet. It could be just saying no to something, you know, even in the organizational context, because at that point in time, you have said no to an opportunity maybe, which for various reasons is not something that you can take up. And the grief of that can stay with you for a very long time. I totally agree with you that it's the first year you somehow get through it. Even through COVID, you managed to, you know, kind of get through it during the first year. It's the second year which hits you harder. It's also a very lonely process, you know, and I think that's where coaches really come in, because my own experience is that, you know, you actually just need somebody to listen to you and acknowledge that your grief is not over. You know, over a period of time, what happens is when you pick up the threads of life, people see you being normal or acting normal. And to them, that time passage has happened, and they try and avoid maybe talking about your losses, but that loss just stays with you, right? And just talking about it and acknowledging that it's not gone, it's not been brushed away, it's still there, you know, just helps tremendously. So I think, if nothing else, just providing them a space to air, to talk about it, even 5 years down the line, when the world has moved on and ostensibly you have moved on, is something that, you know, as coaches, you know, we can really help there. And last but not the least, I think I somehow am not convinced about the word resilience. I think it's a bit overrated, because people expect you to be resilient, and that leads to not being compassionate to yourself, kind to yourself, and to forgive yourself for, maybe not just what people say, wallowing in it or living with it. So I think resilience has its positives, but I find it a very overrated word, especially in this context. Because as you said, it's a journey, it takes its own time. If it ever, the journey ever finds closure, it will come back to you at various points in life and hit you unexpectedly, even 20 years down the line.
Yeah.
And you mull over instances, you mull over, experiences, which if you had done differently, or maybe you could have extended that. So, so I would just like to leave that thought at the end of it, the fact that, I am a bit wary of using the word resilience. And once again, thank you so much. This has been an overwhelming session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunanda, for saying so many things which are, which hold very deep meaning in this space, and personally also for me. You mentioned letting go. As you would read in chapter 4, grief affirmation, first phase, that is of the Alive framework, which is accepting the reality, which is where I say that, for God's sake, please don't say letting go before you say let it sink. I say that there are 3 types of lettings that please notice, and not just in grief, but any kind of, loss, trauma, adversity scenario. Just let it sink in. You can't let go before you have allowed it to sink in. And there's no letting go without allowing letting come. We don't live in voids. The voids don't happen. If we don't consciously fill them, the voids will get filled with whatever is there in the atmosphere, and not all of that is helpful. And you've talked about, the work of coaches. I think the work of coaches, perhaps in 3 ways I see clearly. Like you said, in the grief space, holding the space. Holding the space in the grief space, grief realm. If it is so-called normal bereavement related grief. But remember, even in normal bereavement grief, there could be complicated manifestations, especially when the personalities and the identities and the roles were totally intertwined. It happens in Indian settings, spouses. Yoshita has talked about COVID widows, but it happens with widowers as much, where the spousal relationship is so complete and so entwined that one partner going has thrown, as much as it was an expected loss or a timely loss. I mean, I'm not talking of COVID brutal losses, but in a normal kind of bereavement. But if it was an expected loss, a timely loss, even in that situation, suddenly your life has got no meaning. If the spousal relationship was like this, totally fused, right? So even in a so-called normal bereavement, there could be complicated manifestations. So letting go without letting come. So as coaches, when we bring in those conversations or we support our clients with those conversations, remember that letting go is partnered by letting come, letting in. And before that, there's let the reality sink in. You would read about this in the accepting the reality phase of Alive framework in chapter 4. And then the other space where we coaches can do some work is, as you said, listening, especially because, what happens is that, unfortunately, with all their good intentions, especially relatives, sometimes even neighbors, most of all, your own elders and family members, I won't call them grief insensitive, but I would say perhaps grief non-sensitive, because their intentions are good. They say cliches and platitudes like be strong, move on, time will heal. At least the hardest and the most hurtful and the most painful thing that bereaved parents, I hear them say, and I can totally relate to it, at least you have this more child. As if that compensates. That can never compensate for the child one has lost. So there's so much that one has heard, the grief person has heard. Perhaps what we need to understand is when you don't know, and I can't blame people, because we are personally neither personally attuned nor socially groomed to be around a person in grief. There's a sense of awkwardness, there's a sense of confusion. Perhaps we would also make such goof ups like we end up encountering from others. So I would not blame others, but I would encourage everyone to remember that when you have nothing to say, the best thing to say is not to say anything, and hold this space in noble, respectful silence. Stay alert to their practical needs. Very quietly, without creating unnecessary noise in the grief space, especially in the mourning phase, and especially immediately after the event, death event, and the funerals and other things are being planned. Do the practical stuff quietly. This is perhaps their best help to them. Hold the space. And if you see somebody else being very noisy, in a gentle, quiet way, if you could nudge them to be, some people fill the space with their platitudes and they speak a lot. Grief space doesn't require a lot of speech. So some clients will come to you burdened with and carrying an overload and a carry forward of these so-called insensitive, but I would call them non-sensitive statements and remarks, and the pain that they have left behind. As coaches, we can do a lot of listening to allow this ventilation to happen. And the third space where we coaches definitely have work to do. Other space, perhaps we may still be kind of little nervous, like I used to be very nervous in the beginning and little unclear, but this space is a space where you have a good role to play, is a space of growth conversations. Whenever your clients are giving you hints that they are ready, they are interested, and they are okay to go on with growth conversations, is where you have a bigger role to play. And thank God that you mentioned about resilience. And that is what I'm very happy that you talked about it. And with all humility and a little bit of pride, I have proposed another framework in the book in chapter 5 of resilience, which I called Rise. I would encourage you to read that, which is where I emphasizing that resilience is more about feminine aspect of psyche. It is more about creative and receptive aspect of psyche than about the aggressive.
I think the connection.
My connection gone?
Sorry, we lost you for a bit when you were saying that's more rather than aggressive.
Yeah, so more, I would say rather dynamic side of the resilience has come to be seen as a dynamic side of the psyche, the masculine side of the psyche, the yin side of the psyche, right? So there's this will, there's grit, there's, go on, there's courage, there's strength and all of that. And I say that after this restorative will kindling has happened, then allow your feminine side to take over. And that's what I learned from my son, Utkarsh. When he was all of, I think, 10 or 11, he had a creative writing assignment for the summer break where they were supposed to pick up 10 exotic R words and write which exotic R words they have picked and write their meaning, and then pick one on which to write a short essay. He wrote an essay on resilience. At that age, when he was just about, I think, 10 plus or short of 11, he wrote that yo-yo is an incomplete expression of resilience, because we say it is about bouncing back. I say resilience is about expansiveness. At that stage, he used this word. He said, if you don't bring your hand forward to clasp the yo-yo, yo-yo can go beyond its previously known limits and expand itself up in the space. So, but we throw the yo-yo down and we then grasp the yo-yo.
Yeah.
You can read about it in chapter 5, the Rise framework, and the resilience is about, the feminine. For me, it's a poetic phenomenon. The S that I talk of in the Rise framework is supple strength, not the physical strength or not the mental strength, but a supple strength, which is more about, allowing, witnessing, flowing with it, not moving on in life, but really flowing with, wanting to flow with life, with awareness, with mindfulness, with consciousness, with responsible action, as Viktor Frankl says. that with aware choices comes responsible action. Yeah. So, but it's more about the suppleness of strength. And that is what is the E, expansive emergence. That is what takes us in that direction. I borrowed it from him, expansive emergence. So thank you for mentioning all these.
Thank you so much once again.
By the way, this is the subject of my next book, Resilience.
All right, looking forward to it already.
The work is still kind of started, but let's see, it will take time.
Great. So I'm very mindful of the time, I think.
We are already at what, 45 minutes over.
Yeah. And I see Rakhi has raised her hand, so let's make it very quick and move on. I have also things to carry on. Rakhi.
Thanks, Jaya, for giving me this allowance to speak. Neena, thank you so much for this wonderful journey that you took us through, sharing your experience, your insights. I would like to share something that I've worked and I want to share here, that there is so much that we need to be with ourselves moment to moment and not just get caught up by the words and phrases which are very well known, very well accepted, and yet there is a reality that each person who's going through their grief and loss, they can get present to. Whatever one gets present to in the moment, there is so much to learn from our own selves and acknowledge that this is what is happening, and reflecting what helped us to be with our own brokenness when we are experiencing that moment of pain and agony and suffering, and yet being with ourselves. I think that is such a big strength any individual can draw, no matter where they are. So I think the wisdom that each one of us has, helping people who are going through their suffering, that to get in touch with that, because that is such a powerful place to be in, to deal with whatever one can deal. Because when someone is going through whatever they're going through, it's very difficult for someone to really hold your space the way you want it. People are there to hold, but you don't, maybe your need is something X and you're not getting it. Then I guess we ourselves have to stand up somewhere, even if it is just iota of it. But I think that gives us a lot of strength. So this is what I can share from my own experience of working with my own losses and suffering and grief. Just adding a little bit about my bit. That's it.
Thank you so much for sharing and being mindful of the time. I will not respond to the whole of what you shared, though every word of that is very meaningful. I'll just respond to a couple of things. First is the last thing that you said, that is that sometimes, others are holding space with all of their good intentions and good ways and the good thoughts that they can summon, like how to be supportive. And yet it is not helpful. Perhaps sometimes it is in fact hurtful, and this is what I've emphasized in my book, in the grief affirmation chapter and later in the transformation chapter, opening to the emergent chapter, at different places. I've talked about how we can take the lead in helping others help us. Yeah. So I'm happy that you talked about it, that how I own my grief journey and growth pilgrimage. And you mentioned about, being with our brokenness. And that's again a metaphor that I've used in chapter 3 of kintsugi, the popular Japanese art of, the golden joinery, where the poetry, the pottery, when it is broken, it is not discarded. It is not kind of somehow joined, but joined with a golden lacquer. Yeah. So it's retaining. This is what I say, grief and growth happen together. Golden joinery is not about discarding the pottery or letting it sit in a corner in a broken way, but saying I own the desert of my grief, and I own the choice to also find or create an oasis while still being willing to live with the desert or within the desert.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jaya. I'm sorry, I'm conscious of the fact that it's really gone wrong. I'm sorry. And I'm grateful.
This conversation is very meaningful, and everybody adding their experiences is just so wholesome. And any time is less for something like this. And we all need such conversations on a regular basis to be able to enrich ourselves in our mind and souls and thinking and the way we deal with things. So absolutely no sorry required. Thank you so much for spending time with us, Neena ji. The book has already given me a lot of wisdom, and I encourage all of you to this very, very, very profound work with you, for yourself, for your clients, for your loved ones, and enrich yourselves with so much of experience Neena ji brings to us.
Especially all the exercises in the book, I'm sure that all coaches would find them relevant and useful. You have to perhaps reword them or recontextualize them to any situation that you're working in, not necessarily grief or growth really. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you so much. And we will continue to be in touch and do more work. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm
Thank you so
grateful
much.
to you, Neena, as well as to you, Jaya, for getting this together.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Neena, and thank you, Jaya.
And with love and light and grace to everyone, I say namaste. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neena ji.
Thank you.
Yeah.